My friends, have I got a story for you? A tale of mystery and horror that may shed some light upon a curiosity that some of you have been wondering for quite some time now. What you are now seeing is a small village that is nestled within the mountains. A quiet place, rather dull for the young and adventurous, but the perfect home for those who prefer to live their lives in peace and seclusion. Near this village, a kilometer away into the mountains, is a feature that this village had once taken pride in. A waterfall that would give villagers and visitors the nature experience of peace and solitude. Unfortunately, this scenic beauty had found itself being corrupted with a horrible reputation. As of now, the Waterfall Basin is a horror story, a grave reminder of a curse that preyed upon the village below. Until one day, the stories of this waterfall basin would dramatically evolve into something that would have villagers fearing an evil, something horrible that would be birthed from the very waters of the basin and free to roam the world. It all began when a strange man arrived to this village, a traveling salesman whose origins were unknown but had the intent of offering happiness. That's right, happiness. Knowing how the young age would find this town unsatisfying to their standards, depressing enough to run away into the cities, why not fix the population problem with a reasonable price? So for 50,000 yen, wrapped in a small package is a seed of a beautiful girl. And seeing how this village is a farming community, it shouldn't be difficult finding the right place to bury the seed, water it daily, and in time, a pretty girl will grow from the very spot. Now, depending on where it's buried, sometimes the girl may look strange, but no worries. Once fully grown, she would become the ideal woman for prospective husbands who would want her immediately. Of course, the salesman was normally turned down with this bizarre solution for happiness. Even though the strange man desperately went house to house, trying to sell his strange packages of happiness as expected, his offers were immediately turned down. Even his horrible attempt of a sales pitch went ignored. Of course, there were a few curious villagers who were intrigued. There was even one man who ended up buying one of these packages. But when this buyer unraveled the contents within the package, it realized that the seed for happiness was nothing but a piece of animal flesh that had a horrible stench to it. News of this scheme had spread quickly, causing an outrage within the small village. That the idea of a con man preying upon the helpless and gullible within a secluded farming village just so he could line his pockets was both unthinkable and unacceptable. As expected, the villagers had enough of this horrid act and decided to take action against the salesman, teach him a good lesson for destroying the peaceful nature of this village because of his ways of making a dishonest profit. And as our angry mob chased the salesman out of the village, up the mountain, and all the way to the waterfall basin, cornering the strange man to the edge of the cliff. It was an unexpected act of desperation, opening his suitcase and dumping all the small packages into the water below. A last effort to save his own skin by easing the enraged mob, which somehow succeeded. And that was the last they saw the strange salesman. Unfortunately, it was also the beginning of a horror that would bring this secluded, peaceful village into a shadow of terror. The following days had brought forth an unnatural occurrence that tainted the peaceful nature of this small village. For reasons unknown, there was a growing number of suicides, villagers who would venture to the waterfall and fall to their deaths. What was truly bizarre about all this was the fact that they were all young men. According to friends and family, none of them had any reason to commit suicide. Their lives were happy and fulfilled. It just didn't make any sense. There was even a witness who claimed that one of these men had the look as if he was mesmerized. like he was being drawn to the Waterfall Basin. Nobody knew why this was happening, and because of how none of the victims had shown any signs nor indication of wanting to commit suicide, fear began to take its course upon the villagers. A growing number of people believing that the peaceful village was cursed. But what was unsettling about all this was when they recovered the bodies, each one would be found with their flesh and organs being eaten. Aside from the idea that this could have been from the fish, which was the only thing that could be found within the basin, nobody had any clue as to how the bodies would turn up half-eaten. And regardless of the efforts of trying to stop the suicides, a week after the first victim was found, that was when the suicides doubled. Now, I always find it fascinating how man's fear for the unknown would come with a unique side effect, where the mind would react to a mystery by crafting it into a story with the elements of horror and human imagination. Even though some villagers linger on the belief that their village is cursed, most of them prefer clinging on to the idea that there is a reasonable explanation behind all this. Maybe there's fish within the basin that have an appetite for human flesh. And knowing how such stories exist around the world, monstrous fish dwelling beneath the waters of lakes and rivers, it's also common for brave fishermen to seek out these lake monsters. Which explains why we have two young men who are not under a spell of some sort, but brave or foolish enough to spend their day on chasing after a prized trophy, and possibly solve the strange mystery with the cursed Waterfall Basin. And after an hour of patiently waiting for their fish line to reward them with a curious bite, a few good tugs on the line before one of these boys immediately begin reeling in their catch, that moment of excitement, the reward for patience, and the challenge of being prized with a fine catch from this haunted lake, whatever it was that the boy caught, it was obviously huge. And as the boy used his strength and fortitude against whatever it was that was fighting him in the water, that was when the female's body emerged from the lake, giving both boys a terrifying shock before the fishing pole finally snapped, before watching her slowly sink back into the waters again. Her body was pale, for she had the look of death upon her, possibly another suicide. Immediately, one of the boys began stripping his clothes and dived right into the lake for the body, possibly because of how he could have sworn that she was still alive. However, several minutes went by and there was still no sign of the boy, who was foolish enough to dive into the waters, forcing the other boy with no other choice but to make the same mistake by diving in and saving his friend. Knowing the stories that linger over this Waterfall Basin, not even the act of reckless courage was enough to suppress the inner feelings of fear, for our young hero wasn't without the experience of terror when venturing into the watery unknown, trying to maintain his focus on the fact of his friend being trapped and refrain his thoughts away from the possible horrors that may be lurking within the bottom of this lake. But rather than discovering the mystery behind his absent friend, it seems like our boy had found a dead woman instead, as if she were wedged between two rocks, her body lifeless and trapped. But when taking a closer look upon this morbid discovery, that was when our mystery had introduced an abnormal twist when noticing how the lower body of this woman didn't have legs, but tentacles that were rooted into the rocks. But that was nothing compared to the shocking event that was happening near this strange finding. Below the woman, in a small area, was not only his missing friend, but a swarm of similar-looking women whose bodies were also tentacled and reaching, clawing, and feasting upon the flesh of his friend. The one thing about this scene that would successfully give our foolish hero a traumatizing horror was the look upon his friend's face. With its flesh being torn, his organs being ripped away, there was the expression of content, as if he were enjoying these monstrous women cannibalizing his body, up until the pain and the experience of a violent death overwhelmed the joys of this morbid event. The poor boy who was denied his blissful sense of sadistic happiness when fully realizing the real horror show of his death. And as our fearless hero had realized that his friend was beyond the hopes of being saved, and a victim to a traumatizing horror story, that was when the hands of the lifeless woman would reach out and greet this handsome young man, to be held within the arms of this hero, before giving him a similar experience of love and pain. Just enough horror to have our boy fleeing for his life, that even with his foot being grabbed by the demonic creature of these waters, were not enough to overpower the fear that had driven the boy to the surface. For some unexplained reason, the boy was the only one who succeeded on escaping the horrors of the Waterfall Basin and live to tell a tale of his traumatic experience. The tale of the flesh-eating women who dwelled within the Waterfall Basin, preying upon the helpless and innocent young men by mesmerizing them into the waters of the basin and feasting upon their bodies. That story, my friends, had not only gained popularity for thrill seekers, monster hunters, and the kind of unwanting attention that had destroyed the peaceful nature for the small village. And yet, even though this story would be told for years to come, unfortunately, the tragedy behind the boy's death was nothing more but a ghost story. You see, even though the boy's body was found and his flesh and organs were consumed, like all the other bodies, the problem with this story was that there was no monstrous women found within the lake, nor any evidence that would have authorities suggesting the possibility of women cannibalizing people within the basin. Because of the lack of concrete evidence, authorities were left with no other possibility but see the young man's death as another suicide. It's too bad how a village can go from one of the most peaceful locations within the world to a village that would live in fear because of a lurking terror within the Waterfall Basin, and forever hounded by man's fascination with the supernatural. To this day, none of the villagers have made the connection between the strange salesman and the horrors within the basin. Nobody knew what was happening. Even after the boy's death, several more young men found themselves falling victim to this horrible event. Until a week later, on one night, a new chapter for our horror story, where the evil that lurked within the waters of the basin would suddenly rise to the surface and finally begin taking its first steps through the village below. A group of naked women with the exact same face, identical, walking through the village as if it was a macabre parade. Not only was this the first time the village would get a chance to see the evil that dwelled within the basin, the very thing that preyed upon helpless villagers would also be the last they would see this evil. Except, seeing how the human imagination likes to run wild with the supernatural, they don't know that, for they still fear the unknown horrors that may be lurking within the Waterfall Basin. Even though the parade of demonic women had left the horrified village and went off in different directions, spreading their terror into the open world, unfortunately, because of the combination of human ignorance and superstition, the village was never freed from the fear of the Waterfall Basin, nor had they ever seen a day of peace and solitude again.